Back in April of 2014, me and my old mate Paul took the long drive up to Loch Arbor in Scotland, chasing a quiet weekend of fishing. We'd known each other since we were kids, kicking mud in primary school. The sort of friendship welded together by scraped knees and secret jokes. But once adulthood sank its teeth in, jobs, marriages, children, we drifted into that slow, guilty rhythm where months passed before we even realized we hadn't hung out. Somewhere around 2009 or 2010, in the middle of that slow fade, Paul asked if I wanted to go fishing with him. I said yes, without thinking. I couldn't have known then that this tiny choice, this harmless little invitation, would be the first domino in a chain that would unravel into one of the most terrifying, bewildering, and soul-staining experiences of my entire life. I didn't even know Paul gave a damn about fishing when he asked me along. But the moment I joined him that first time, I understood exactly why he needed it. The guy worked his 9 to 5 like a machine, dragged himself home to wrangle the kids into their pajamas. And yeah, he loved them. You could hear it in his voice. But the grind of being a young parent wears you thin in places you didn't even know you could fray. Back in my early 20s, I would have laughed at the idea of sitting on a riverbank for hours, doing absolutely sod all. It sounded like boredom dressed up as a hobby. But once life became a choice between chaos at work or chaos exploding at home, an afternoon by the water started feeling like the closest thing to peace I'd ever tasted. Almost sacred. Fast forward about 4 years. We're rumbling up some narrow road toward a private loch. We'd been granted permission to fish. A friend of a friend's dad had a membership, so if anyone asked, we'd just drop his name and all would be well. Permission mattered, especially since we planned on pitching camp for 2 nights. It wasn't our first rodeo either. By then, we'd gone on at least a dozen trips. Long enough to evolve from clueless fools with a tarp to self-proclaimed seasoned outdoorsmen armed with gadgets to make life easier. We had the jet boil for tea and coffee, portable charging packs for the phones, a little speaker for music, small comforts that chipped away at the cold edges of the wild. But that year, Paul had something extra tucked away for me. Just after we set up camp, he grinned like a man with a secret and pulled out a waterproof bag. Inside were 2 small walkie-talkies, all charged up and supposedly able to last a whole week. For a weekend, they were overkill in the best way. His idea was simple: save our phone batteries, which usually died fast because we couldn't resist blasting music or showing each other stupid videos like a pair of teenagers. And honestly, the walkies made perfect sense. You might picture a fishing weekend as 2 blokes glued to each other's side. But in reality, we drifted off constantly. One of us off hunting for firewood, the other digging up fresh bait, or rummaging through camp for something forgotten. Firewood alone could take ages. Having radios wasn't just smart. It was stupidly fun. I'd be off in the trees snapping twigs like a caveman when Paul's voice would crackle through the static. Zulu 5-9er, this is Oscar Kilo Charlie. You're a bellend and your mum's a slag over. and I'd stand there in the woods, laughing like an idiot as I thumbed the button and fired back. Copy that. But I can confirm she wouldn't touch you with a stick. Over. Back and forth we'd go, trading insults like we were on some half-assed military mission. Just two grown men, acting like kids again, with the whole quiet Scottish wilderness listening in. We'd fire off stupid little exchanges like that any time we split up. Even on the Saturday afternoon, when I ended up walking 6 miles round trip just to buy a bloody lighter. Both of ours had died within half an hour of each other. Cheap plastic junk. And since we'd already knocked back a couple cans of lager, I told Paul I'd do the trek while he stayed behind to watch the gear. We kept chatting on the walkies as long as they'd let us. But somewhere around the 2-mile stretch, the signal just gave up. The hills swallowed it whole. By the time I stumbled into this tiny countryside newsagent, a place that smelled like dust, newspapers, and old sweets, I was knackered. I grabbed a handful of disposable lighters and some other useless bits you always end up buying on impulse. Then I turned around and started the long 3-mile trudge back. Every so often, I'd thumb the radio and ask if Paul could hear me. Nothing, just dead air for the first mile. Then, once I crested the bigger hills, the static started to whisper in. Thin, broken pieces of sound. Not enough to talk, but enough to make me think the signal was clawing its way back to life. I kept testing it, pacing myself with the rhythm of clicking the button every minute or two, wondering why I'd had better luck on the way out than on the way back. And then, without warning, the radio crackled hard, like someone scraping a fork across a metal plate. A voice was buried somewhere in that mess, but at first I couldn't make out a single word. I tried telling Paul I couldn't hear him properly, but he wasn't responding. Maybe he couldn't hear me at all. I kept walking, my stomach tightening, keeping the radio pressed close, as if holding it near my face would magically help. I waited for his voice to push through the static, and when it finally did, I knew something was deeply, frighteningly wrong. At first, it came through as a metallic whine, high-pitched, unnatural, like a kettle screaming underwater. I figured it had to be interference. I turned the radio off, then on again. But the second it powered up, the sound blasted through louder, clearer. And it wasn't interference. It was Paul, and he was crying. Not loud, hysterical sobbing. No, this was worse. It was the soft, broken whimper of a man trying and failing to keep himself together. The kind of sound you only hear when something inside someone has snapped. I could hear him pressing the transmit button in little bursts, like he didn't even know he was doing it, just weeping into the mic. I asked the obvious question. "Mate, are you all right?" Thinking maybe he'd gotten some horrible text message. Nobody cries like that unless someone's dead or the world has just tilted sideways beneath them. I kept asking what happened, walking faster, but he never answered. I guessed he still couldn't hear me. Maybe these bargain bin walkies weren't half as reliable as we thought. I picked up the pace, almost speed walking now, trying to coax him into talking. Then suddenly, he spoke. "Oh, thank God," I blurted, thinking he finally heard me. But the words that came out of him were wrong. raw and wet with grief. "Lydia, who is he? I'm so sorry." I stopped dead in the road. "What the? Mate, who the fuck is Lydia? What's going on?" He didn't reply. He didn't even react. He just kept whispering her name, crying, repeating it through choked breaths. Paul had never mentioned a Lydia in his entire life. His girlfriend wasn't named that, his kids weren't named that, so why the hell was he saying it now? I started jogging, heart pounding like it was trying to punch through my ribs, and his voice kept getting louder, more panicked. "I'm so sorry, Lydia. Please, please forgive me." Every few seconds, I'd gasp into the radio. "I'm coming, mate. I'm almost there. Just hang on." While the wind carried his broken sobs up through the hills like something wounded was calling out across the land. "Hey, whatever's going on, we'll sort it out, all right?" I kept saying that into the radio, trying to sound steady, like I had even the faintest clue what I was walking into. But the truth was uglier. I was scared shitless. I had never heard Paul cry like that. Not once. Even back in primary school, when he split his head open, falling off a rope swing and bled all over his Spider-Man t-shirt. He clenched his jaw and refused to shed a single tear. He'd looked like a stubborn little soldier being marched off to battle. So to hear him now, really sobbing, broken, shaking, terrified, it put the fear of God straight through me. Whatever had happened, it wasn't small. It wasn't nothing. It was something that was ripping him apart. And the worst part? I knew I'd probably be useless. If something awful had happened, all I'd be able to do was drag him back to Manchester, let him drown himself in lager, and hope the pieces eventually stopped shaking. Once the campsite was only a few minutes away, I kept muttering into the radio, "Nearly there, mate, nearly there," stepping faster, practically jogging. I was so close, just a few hundred meters now. The radios had worked perfectly at this distance before, so I expected, desperately, to hear him finally respond. But instead of his voice, I heard a scream. It blasted through the speaker so violently that the distortion came roaring back. Paul's voice shredding itself as he cried out, "Lydia, Lydia, please forgive me." Then came a howl, this drawn-out electronic shriek that sounded half human, half machine. Before the radio dropped into a silence so complete it made my skin crawl. I ran like something was chasing me. My boots slammed against the dirt track that led from the entrance of the private loch. And I didn't stop, not once, until I burst back into camp. And Paul wasn't there. No sign of him. Not by the tents, not by the fire pit. Nothing. My lungs burned as I sucked in a breath and roared, "Paul, where are you?" The sound ripped out of me, cracked and frantic. Nothing answered. I shouted again, voice tearing itself raw, stumbling from the camp down toward the water where we'd been fishing. "Paul!" My chest felt tight, too tight, as the loch came into view. Empty. Completely empty. Another scream tore out of me. "Paul, where the hell are you?" And then, suddenly, casually, maddeningly, I heard him. "What?" he called back, sounding almost annoyed, like I'd interrupted him. I spun toward the trees on my left. There he was, strolling out of the shade with an armful of firewood, looking for all the world like a man who'd been doing nothing more stressful than picking up sticks. His face wasn't tear-streaked. His eyes weren't red. He wasn't trembling or panicked or anything remotely close to what I'd heard on the radio. He looked absolutely fine, perfectly normal. And in that moment, the world tilted sideways. My first thought was prank. It had to be. Paul loved winding me up. He always had. And the idea that he'd gotten bored of his mock military banter and decided to try out some Oscar-worthy horror performance. Yeah, that made sense. That was safe. That was rational. But when I stared at him, still breathless, still shaking, and asked, "Is this a joke?" He blinked at me and said, "No," in a tone that was mostly convincing, but not enough to calm me, not with his track record. I waited for the grin, the sudden bark of laughter, the triumphant "gotcha" that would bring the ground back under my feet. It never came. He just looked confused, genuinely confused, and asked what the hell was wrong with me. And honestly, in hindsight, I can see why. There I was, red-faced, panting, sweating like a lunatic who'd just sprinted from the devil himself. And the only thing I could think to say once I reached him was, "Is this a prank?" He held up his radio to show me. He'd had it on him the entire time. But according to him, he hadn't heard a single thing. Paul said the radio had gone dead the moment I'd lost range on my way to the shop. And he hadn't heard a single thing from me until I came crashing back into camp, drenched in sweat and panic, looking like I'd just outrun something unspeakable in the woods. When I finally caught my breath, felt that shaky wave of relief wash through me, I started spilling everything I'd heard over the radio. The crying, the whimpering, the apologies, all of it. "I heard you crying," I told him, still breathing hard. He frowned. "Me? Crying? What are you on about?" We went back and forth until we both agreed that, yeah, I'd clearly heard someone sobbing through that radio. But no, it couldn't have been him. It didn't sound like any stranger either. But that was a thought I didn't want to touch yet. But then I mentioned the name. The moment I said the voice had been apologizing to someone called Lydia. Something in Paul's expression twisted, subtle, but unmistakable. His face didn't turn pale or frightened. It wasn't anger. It was something far stranger. Confusion, so sharp it almost looked painful. His brow knotted, his eyes darkened, and for a second he seemed to lose his place in the world. "Wait," I said, the dread returning all at once. "You do know a Lydia?" Paul didn't answer straight away. He just stared at me, almost blankly, like his thoughts were scattered out of reach. When he finally spoke, it came out slow and hesitant. "I haven't told you, have I?" "Told me what?" I asked. He looked down, swallowed, then asked, "Have you been snooping through my phone?" "What? No," I snapped. "Why would I? Paul, just tell me what's going on." I'd gone from terrified to relieved to confused. And now I was climbing the ladder back toward terror again. The name Lydia meant something to him, something real. And if it wasn't a coincidence, then whatever had happened to me on that walk, it was worse than I imagined. I must have rephrased the question half a dozen times before I finally managed, "Who the fuck is Lydia, Paul?" He opened his mouth like he was about to explain, then stopped short. "How the fuck do you know?" he shot back. "Know what?" I barked. "I heard someone saying her name. I thought it was you. That's all I know. You obviously know more than me, so just fucking tell me." For a moment, he looked like he was about to scream, veins tightening in his neck. And then something in him softened. He dragged in a deep breath, steadied himself, and began talking in this quiet, controlled voice that didn't match the panic in his eyes. He told me piece by piece that only two people in the world knew what he was about to say. Only him and his girlfriend. No one else, not even family. She'd just found out she was pregnant, only about a week before our trip. They hadn't been trying, but once the initial shock settled, they decided they wanted the baby. They'd even started tossing around names. That was their little routine. She'd suggest one, he'd say yes, no, or maybe. If the baby turned out to be a boy, Max was their strongest contender. But if it was a girl, both Paul and his girlfriend agreed the most beautiful name on their list, the one they both felt drawn to, was Lydia. When he said the name out loud again, the world just froze. I stood there staring at him, my mind trying to reassemble itself. Finally, all I could manage was, "Are you joking? This isn't a prank, right?" He swore on his kids' lives that he wasn't joking. He hadn't cried. He hadn't heard a single thing from me on the radio. He hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy. And he definitely wasn't making up the name. We just stood there, two grown men, each holding 100 impossible questions, both of us searching the other's face for answers that didn't exist. Paul demanded, I swear I hadn't talked to his girlfriend or snooped through his phone. I swore right back, and somewhere in the silence between us, the woods around the loch felt suddenly, horribly aware of us. I swore blind I hadn't touched his phone, hadn't spoken to his girlfriend, hadn't done a damn thing except hear someone use the name Lydia through that crackling radio. And the thing that chilled me most, the thing that made my skin crawl, was that the voice hadn't just said the words. It had sounded like him. Not the crying, no, that was different. But the tone, the cadence, the way he choked out, "I'm so sorry, Lydia. Please forgive me." It was close enough to twist my stomach. What followed, I don't even know how to explain it properly. Surreal doesn't quite cover it. Once we accepted, truly accepted, that neither of us was lying, we realized we were trapped in some bizarre reality where nothing made sense. Something weird, dangerously weird, had happened out there, and both of us were on edge like a pair of spooked animals. The only explanation we could cling to was that I'd picked up another transmission. Someone nearby must have been on a different channel, and somehow I'd responded on their frequency instead of Paul's. That would explain why Paul never heard me. It would explain why the grieving voice shouting Lydia's name hadn't acknowledged me. He wasn't ignoring me. He simply wasn't listening on that channel. It was the only idea that didn't feel like we were stepping off the cliff into madness. Still, even after we settled with that explanation, my nerves wouldn't fully settle. Neither would his. But we forced ourselves to accept the most rational option we had. That the name Lydia, coming through the radio, was just some insane coincidence. 1 in a million. 1 in a billion, maybe. But still, technically possible. The bigger, uglier question lurking underneath that was this. What the hell had happened to that poor bastard? What pushes someone to cry, scream, and beg forgiveness over a radio like that? We talked ourselves out of the paranormal route, mostly because the alternative was too much to handle, and spent the rest of the night running through every angle we could think of. Eventually, with enough whiskey and wishful thinking, we convinced ourselves there had to be a logical answer. A grim one maybe, but logical. Maybe I'd overheard someone in the middle of a breakdown. Maybe the scream at the end meant he'd done something awful, maybe worse, chilling, yes, but still within the bounds of reality. And humans will cling to reality, even when it cuts. When we got home, the whole experience turned into one of those campfire stories you tell with a grin. We told it to our mates, told it at the pub, and, as expected, a few called it bollocks. But the people who really knew us, who knew we weren't the type to spin ghost stories just to sound interesting, they believed something strange had happened. Maybe not supernatural, but still twisted in its own right. The fact we weren't the "Oi lads, we saw a ghost" type made it easier for them to believe us. For a while, that's all it was. A curiosity. A weird little anecdote that lived somewhere between creepy and darkly amusing. But months passed, and in that dead space where the mind wanders when you're showering, or drifting to sleep, or driving alone at night, I started having thoughts that made my blood run cold. I know full well radio transmissions can't travel backward in time, not in any world we understand. I've looked it up God knows how many times, dozens, hundreds, and every resource said the same thing. Impossible, ridiculous. But then I started reading the fringe science stuff, wormholes, tachyons, quantum signatures, and some of those papers, the ones written by people far smarter than me, suggested that in theory, on paper, signals could slip backward under the right conditions. Phone calls, radio transmissions, fragments of communication preserved like ghosts in reverse. Maybe you're wondering why I'm suddenly rambling about tachyons and time loops. Fair enough. So let me be clear. My worst fear, the fear that dug its claws into me late at night, long after the laughter about that trip died, is that I didn't overhear a stranger. I overheard something from the future, or at least something that could happen. Something involving Paul and his daughter, the one he and his girlfriend wanted to name Lydia. And yes, before you ask, the baby did come to pass. Paul and his girlfriend had a little girl in January of 2015, and she just turned 10 last month. I'm writing this in February of 2025, and she's a bright, happy kid with her dad's grin and her mum's stubborn streak. But I won't lie to you. When I first heard it was a girl, and when I heard they'd actually chosen the name Lydia, something cold slid straight through my spine. A proper chill. One of those instinctive, animal reactions you can't reason your way out of. I told myself I was being ridiculous, superstitious, even. I told myself that if it had been a boy or a girl with any other name, I would have laughed about the whole damn thing and put it behind me forever. But it wasn't another name. It was Lydia. Exactly the name I'd heard over that radio. Exactly the name I'd heard choked out through static and sobs. So I smiled for Paul. I hugged him. I congratulated him like any good mate should. But beneath all that, something rotten was blooming inside me. A slow creeping dread that something awful was destined to happen. Not an if, a when. And the horrible truth? For the last 10 years, I've worried about it almost every single day. As Lydia grew, learned to walk, started school, celebrated birthdays, the knot in my chest gradually loosened. The older she gets, the less that old terror claws at me. Watching Paul post pictures of her laughing, playing, celebrating, each year that passed without disaster felt like a small victory. A quiet exhale I didn't know I'd been holding. But there's still this little corner of my mind, a cold, whispering corner that won't shut up. It wonders whether the story isn't finished, whether something is still waiting, whether the horror I heard on that radio hasn't caught up yet. One bloke online suggested a strange idea, comforting, in a twisted sort of way. He said maybe what I heard wasn't a fixed event from the future, but a possible one. Something that could have happened, but didn't. That maybe the sheer act of hearing it, of becoming aware, somehow nudged things off that dark path. That I'd stumbled into the universe's warning system, and by some weird fluke, we avoided catastrophe. God, I want to believe that. I cling to it some nights like a life raft. I hope to hell I've just spent a decade catastrophizing a bizarre, one-in-a-billion coincidence, because the alternative is so terrifying I can barely let myself think it.